Industrial emissions rules are moving faster than Capex. Industrial operators face a structural problem that no amount of strategic intent resolves on its own. The timelines embedded in regulatory compliance are no longer compatible with the timelines built into standard capital planning. Emissions regulations across air permitting, methane reporting, greenhouse gas disclosure, and carbon pricing are advancing on schedules measured in months. The capital approval, procurement, and installation cycles required to respond to them are measured in years. That gap is no longer theoretical. For a growing number of facilities, it is becoming a live compliance exposure. Regulatory timelines are now shorter than the lead time to order the equipment required to meet them. The compression is happening on multiple fronts, simultaneously. The timeline pressure is not coming from a single rule. It is arriving simultaneously across several regulatory frameworks, each with its own enforcement calendar. In the United States, the IRA's methane waste emission charge, BWE, was designed to escalate to $1,500 per metric ton of methane by 2026, applying to oil and gas facilities reporting above 25,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent annually under EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. Congress voided the implementing rule in early 2025. Both chambers passed HJRES 35 under the Congressional Review Act, and President Trump signed it on March 14, 2025. EPA formally removed the WEC regulations from the Code of Federal Regulations, effective May 19, 2025. The One Big Beautiful Bill, PL 199-21, further rescinded unobligated funds and amended the program's scope. The charge is effectively suspended, but the underlying statutory obligation under IRA Section 136 has not been fully repealed, and the legal landscape remains unresolved. For industrial operators, the WEC rollback illustrates a risk that cuts in the opposite direction. Federal deregulatory action can create a false sense of compliance relief while state-level and international regulatory clocks continue running on independent timelines. A facility that restructured its methane monitoring posture around federal enforcement expectations is now managing a different exposure profile than one that mapped its obligations site by site. California's SB 253 and SB 261 require Scope 1 and 2 emissions disclosure beginning in 2026 for companies with over $1 billion in gross annual revenue doing business in the state, with Scope 3 following in 2027. The enforcement of SB 261 remains under a Ninth Circuit injunction, but SB 253 Scope 1/2 reporting obligations are moving forward. And the compliance infrastructure required to support accurate reporting requires data systems and operational controls that cannot be stood up in a single budget cycle. In the EU, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, entered its definitive phase on January 1, 2026. For industrial operators exporting steel, cement, aluminum, fertilizers, and electricity into the EU, CBAM is no longer a future consideration. It is a current cost variable that depends directly on the emissions intensity of production, a figure now subject to external verification. The EU also published its Environmental Omnibus package in December 2025, proposing simplification of the Industrial Emissions Directive, IED. While the package aims to reduce administrative burden, it does not reduce emissions obligations. It restructures how they are administered. Companies that interpret simplification as a slowdown in regulatory pressure are likely to misread the signal, where the Capex timeline breaks down. The standard capital approval cycle at an industrial facility, from initial scoping through board approval, engineering, procurement, and commissioning, runs 24 to 48 months for a significant process change or emissions control installation. That is the optimistic case, absent supply chain delays. Equipment lead times for electrostatic precipitators, selective catalytic reduction systems, continuous emissions monitoring upgrades, and carbon capture retrofit components have extended significantly since 2022. In many cases, procurement to delivery windows now exceed 18 months for specialty equipment. The practical implication? A facility that identifies a compliance gap today, receives board approval in Q3 2026, and enters procurement in Q4 2026 may not achieve operational compliance until late 2028, potentially 2 to 3 reporting cycles into an enforcement exposure window. The window between we need to act and we are in compliance now routinely exceeds the window regulators allow between a deadline and enforcement. 3 decisions that determine exposure level. Industrial operators have limited options for managing this mismatch, but the distinction between high exposure and lower exposure companies comes down to 3 capital planning decisions. Timing of internal scoping relative to regulatory calendars. Companies that begin feasibility and engineering work before the compliance deadline, rather than after the rule is finalized, retain meaningful optionality. Companies that wait for final rules before initiating internal review lose 12 to 18 months they cannot recover. Whether emissions controls are integrated into existing capital replacement cycles, replacing aging emissions control equipment with compliant alternatives at end of life is materially less expensive than early replacement. The facilities making the most progress are aligning compliance investments with replacement timelines already in the capital plan. That window is event-dependent and does not wait for regulatory convenience. How the capital approval process handles regulatory risk. Most industrial capital approval frameworks were not designed to process risk management investments on compliance timelines. Hurdle rates that work well for revenue-generating projects consistently undervalue compliance investments whose cost of inaction is fines, permit exposure, or forced shutdown, not just a missed return. Recalibrating the approval framework is a governance decision, not an engineering one. What this means for industrial operations leadership. The operational implication is straightforward. Waiting for regulatory certainty before beginning capital planning has become a more expensive posture than acting on regulatory probability. The direction of emissions rules across the US and EU is not structurally reversing, even as specific rules face legal challenges or administrative delay. The federal EPA's current deregulatory posture introduces some near-term rule-specific uncertainty, particularly around the endangerment finding and vehicle emission standards, but does not neutralize the state-level and international regulatory clocks that industrial operators with multi-site or cross-border footprints are running against simultaneously. A facility exempt from a federal rule may still face California, EU CBAM, or customer-driven disclosure requirements on independent timelines. For operations and EHS leadership, the practical task is a gap analysis mapping current facility emissions profiles against the regulatory timelines that apply to each site, not the average regulatory environment. Not every facility carries the same exposure, and not every rule reaches every operation. But the analysis requires the same capital planning inputs, whether the regulatory risk is high or low. Current emissions baseline, control technology options, procurement lead times, and integration with existing replacement schedules. The risk that is often underpriced. The most common compliance risk in this environment is not a single major violation. It is incremental exposure that accumulates across reporting cycles, disclosure inconsistencies, monitoring gaps, or permit conditions that have not been updated to reflect operational changes that collectively form a pattern regulators are trained to identify. As federal enforcement is being reshaped by administrative mechanisms that move more quickly than traditional judicial enforcement, with immediate compliance obligations and fewer procedural pauses. Companies structured around historical enforcement timelines are discovering the new timelines are shorter than their compliance programs were built to accommodate. A separate analysis of how 2026 compliance exposure is forming inside reporting systems identified reporting inconsistencies, not permit violations, as an increasing enforcement trigger. Facilities whose operational changes outpace their permit and reporting updates are generating exactly the discrepancy patterns that accelerated administrative enforcement targets first. The capital allocation dimension, there is a broader boardroom dimension to this problem. Decarbonization capital is already under pressure from shareholder return demands and activist scrutiny. The compliance investment case is structurally easier to defend than the decarbonization ROI case because the cost of inaction is concrete and quantifiable. Fines, permit suspension, and forced operational modifications have dollar figures attached. But the compliance investment case requires legal, operations, and finance leadership working from the same regulatory calendar simultaneously, and most organizations are not structured to do that naturally. The companies managing this most effectively are treating compliance capital as a separate category with its own approval logic, time-bound, risk-priced, and integrated with regulatory timelines rather than evaluated against standard investment return thresholds. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.